So now that you have Unity Hub set up, we're going to talk about the Unity editor itself. And before we do that, we want to make sure that a few things are set up so that you can be sure you can run code and things like that. So I'm going to go over here to Unity Preferences and look at my editor settings. If you're on Windows, this menu item is going to show up under Edit somewhere around here. So I'm going to go to Preferences, and the first thing I'm going to check is the external tools. And this is going to show me what tools are connected to Unity. And in particular, the code editor that we need is Visual Studio. Now, it is the case that if you know other editors like Visual Studio Code or even Atom, you can connect them to Unity. But just to make your life easy, I would suggest using Visual Studio because that's the way most of the examples and tutorials are set up for. In addition, you would also make sure that editor attaching is checked, and we're just going to leave it like it is for now and see how it works. But that should be set up correctly. The next thing we want to look at is this sort of layout here. This is the standard Unity layout, and here in the middle we have the scene. And if we look up here, we'll notice that we have these tabs. So here we have the game tab. This is what it's going to look like when the game is actually playing, and it gives you the screen that you're going to see. And then up here we have the asset store, and this is if you want to try to import things into your game at this point. Now over here we have the inspector, and one of the things is I'm not crazy about this layout, so I'm going to change my layout because I like my inspector on the right, but I want all of my other stuff kind of close over here because when I'm doing mouse work, I want it to all be sort of centralized. So I'm going to come over here to default. This is the layout, and I'm going to select tall. Now what tall is going to do is it's going to put sort of my game in its own main screen, which I kind of like. And then I have my scene hierarchy, which is this window right here. And then I have my project, which is this little tab right here. And then I have an inspector. The one thing that we're missing is the console, and the console is where you can sort of print output to. And so I'm going to come over here to Window, and I'm going to go to General, and then Console. And this is going to bring up another tab. And I generally like my console possibly to either be down here with the game, or again, because I kind of like my game on its own, I like to put the console over here in the bottom right corner. We'll see as we do things that we can set this up differently. Now these folders correspond identically with the folders that you have on your system. So if in a Mac, I can go to Finder, and in Windows, you're going to go to Explorer, File Explorer. I'm going to go to my desktop. Oops, that's the wrong desktop. GP1, and you'll see this folder assets here, and this folder assets matches exactly what we see here. Now this is just some stuff that's set up for source control, so you don't have to worry about that. But I kind of talked about in the assignment that you need to create a folder called labs, and so I'm going to do that. And the easiest way to do that is simply, I could use the plus here, but I'm going to just right click, and I'm going to say create, and then I'm going to say folder, and I'm going to say labs, and this will create a labs folder. Now, if I save my project and go back over here, you'll see that I have an identical labs folder. So there's a one-to-one correspondence between the files here and then what's in your assets in your on your system. Okay. So in terms of settings, that's how we want to set things up. I also want to save my scene here. Right now, if you look here, my scene is called sample scene, but I want to set up a folder for each one of my labs because I want all of my assets to sort of be there in the same place. So for example, I'm going to create another folder and I can call it lab 1. And then I can take this scene and I'm going to drag it into lab 1. And then this scene is called sample scene, and it's the same sample scene here. Okay, and the way that Unity organizes all of the objects in your scene is through this thing that we call the scene hierarchy, and it's designed like this so that you can attach objects to other objects, and then they can be moved around sort of all together. But I don't like the name of this scene, so I'm going to rename it. Okay, and it's going to say, oh, I have to reload it. That's fine. Now my scene is called Lab 1. That makes sense, and I have a camera, and so on and so forth. Now, if I look over here in game object, you'll see that I have different menu items. So I can create an empty game object, I can create an empty child, I can create 3D objects, which we're not going to do in this class, but I can create 2D objects, which is mostly what we'll do, especially around sprites and things like that. And then I have all sorts of other things to create. So let's just create an empty object just so we can see how that looks. Okay, so this is a game object and it just sort of gives it a generic name. And the inspector here will tell us properties that are used for the game object. Okay, so again, this is its name, and let's call it planet, for example. You'll notice that it changes over here. Okay, we have tags, we have layers. These things we'll talk about later. But one of the most important things that we have on it is this transform, and this transform has 3 settings on it: position, rotation, and scale. And from these, I can change where the position are. Now, I can't really see anything because if I sort of zoom in, I did that with my mouse wheel, then I can sort of see this little object here. But it doesn't have like a physical representation, so it's not going to be drawn. I'd have to add a component to it. But I can change its X and Y position with this transform. If you look here, you can see this little circle, sort of faint circle, moving as I change it. Now, you might be wondering, how did he do that? Now, I moused over the X or the Y or the Z, okay? And then I click and I drag it to the left or to the right. And this lets me change it. Rotation, you won't be able to see. Scaling, you should be able to see if I had a sprite on it, but otherwise it's just going to look like a point in space, okay? So I'm just resetting these so that it's back in its location.